So some of my points I will give here in my talk about tools and techniques of game localization will be a kind of summary of what we already heard today. But in my second part, I would like to invite you to look at the files, the data, which has been published for the beta test, Karin also mentioned earlier this afternoon, to prepare you to have all the technical tools and knowledge you need to do the localization in a few months. So what we already heard, so video games are audiovisual products, so you have to do with the translation of oral and of dialogic texts. So we heard, especially when Karin was talking about dialogue writing for dubbing or lip sync, subtitling is as well something one has to do with. And a big part is the translation of narrative text. And this is really different from technical text, from pure UI elements. So there you get either the information about the game world and its characters, but in a kind, or in this kind of software in the game, you have as well functional text. So we have both types of text in those applications. And finally, so you have a good mix of everything, but the creative one is certainly the one which is predominant here. So in game localization you have, or game localization differs from localization of other software products because of this kind of special text. So they require a particular kind of translation. Different areas of knowledge, so we heard about fantasy, but history is as well an application field. You have to know something about a special or a specific historic period in some games. And often you have as well to do with the popular culture, so the variety of linguistic fields is rather huge. Therefore, the challenges are obvious, so you have to be creative, and a lot of work is done by teams, so you are not a single translator working for yourself. You have to share your knowledge and your discussion with others. What we heard from Martina and Isabel, there are situations where we have long working days because one of the things in localization and for many other software products is the simultaneous shipment, and therefore a product has to be finished. And what we heard as well, sometimes, or perhaps often, you have to do the translation without the game itself, so you don't have really an idea of what it looks like if it is published. The problem on the linguistic side is not only that you don't have an idea or can't imagine the graphics, but sometimes the context or the context in which you work is missing, and this demands a certain creativity, and in many fields, what we heard from Karin, it's only the tester which finally recognizes that there is something which doesn't fit into your game. So I already mentioned the variety of textual types, and it's not up to you to decide whether a certain linguistic style is okay or not, because in many circumstances there are fans with very specific expectations for the game universe, so you can't decide whether you name one character in this or that way. So it already has been decided. And if we now look at some specific features of game or video game translation, we have two types of games. Those that demand more research than creativity, perhaps in a certain historic field, and others which demand more creativity than research. And we heard early in the afternoon when Stefan Schlechtweg told us some scenarios of game design that we have to do as well with invented words. And you can't look in a dictionary how this is translated in a given language. So you have to invent, to be creative as well. And in many fields, the challenge is to understand the jargon used and to look for something which is equivalent in your target language. And there you have to render it with a particular terminology for the given locale you are working with. And we heard that glossaries nowadays are something which play an important role, so one has to prepare a glossary. Style guides are used, and we have often to do, that was a very nice example we heard as well with the audio, with limited space and length of text fields, as well on the written as on the audio side. And for instance, the example I have chosen here is, this is rather difficult for a gamer to get what is meant here, because every word that has been abbreviated, so you have really to be in this game world to have an idea what things mean. So this is something which really is not very adapted to the audience, and it doesn't fulfill usability of a game. So something I took from Daniel Stein, I believe you learned him, did you? Yes. Who once was working for a game localization company as well, and he sketched some terminological challenges. So, for instance, in a casual game, out of which this example is taken, you have a variety of bottles, but then you have the difficulty to look for equivalents for target language solutions for each of those different bottles. And how do you proceed in such a case? And what he proposed is to look, so you have a concept, so there's the bottle here, and you have to decide upon the task in which each of this concept, in which each bottle is used, so that you have a kind of decision help for your target language equivalent. And another terminological challenge is shown here. So you have, this is a fact in other domains as well, you have divergent concepts eventually in different languages. Here, for instance, it's the concept of a steering wheel, and I put here both small images because the steering wheel in English is as well a steering wheel for a ship or an automobile, and you have to give additional information to make clear for which domain the term is used in the game. So when we talk about translatable assets, so what has to be translated? We heard a number of things already. So you have the website where a game is promoted, or where you find the game to be downloaded. You have the packaging, so the games box, for instance. In many cases, manual, sometimes only a functional one, but in other cases where the history is told, so like a kind of fairy tale book. Then you have the software itself, so the game software with README files, with dialogues for, or a dialogue for dubbing, another one for subtitling. You have the user interface and graphics with different text layers. So this is something we didn't really talk about so much this afternoon. So good video games have really complex graphics, and in many of those graphical items you have texts. And the question of internationalization here is if the designer had thought about putting the text on different layers, or if he had hard-coded the text, then it comes out to be a problem or a question of redesigning the graphic. So if I talk about text and code, then for the translator, one of the challenges is text fragmentation. So sometimes you have a kind of cryptic game source code, and in a game you have linguistic assets that have to be extracted, and they finally have to be transformed in a format that is useful for all parties, that is for the developer and for the localizers, because after you have localized the text, it has to be re-imported into the game environment. So in this context, one of the biggest problems for the translation is that translatable strings often incorporate variables. So these variables express either name, or may express name, gender, nationality, and these are features that are not expressed in all languages the same way. And if we have a look at variables, for instance, one should, as a developer, avoid things like, here for instance, /n, name of nation, is attacking you. Then if you think of examples like Rome is attacking you, this isn't a problem. But if you have a plural at this place, for instance, the Vikings, so the entire phrase is grammatically wrong, and this has to be thought of when writing the text at an initial phase. So instead you could use, for instance, as a texter for a game, you are being attacked by, and then this final position in many languages is less problematic than the one we saw at the beginning. So you are being attacked by, and then either the singular or the plural. Other problems arise when you have to do with concatenated strings. This is something as well very problematic when you use cat tools, because often the concatenation breaks are breaks for your segments, and you have a kind of puzzle in your cat tool translation memory. So let's imagine that a kind of concatenation is used in order to generate a newspaper headline. And if this, for instance, is formed like, or with adjective noun, and then some kind of fixed form from, and then band, at, so you have different positions where the text may vary, but this may be correct in English, for instance, but may provoke enormous problems in French or in German and other languages. So here really is a need for internationalization, and there the developers need to be aware of this problem. And the task of the localizer, if he or she has this opportunity, is to make people sensible, or to make them aware of these kind of problems. So another point of internationalization that is important here is in a game, or a game has to be coded in a way that it enables implementation of regional standards. So if you have time or dates, for instance, they have to be correctly shown in the locale in which you play. And another thing where we have a lack of internationalization is, for instance, here we see an example of a hard-coded string. So we have the text directly in the code, and this is really a problem for the localization process, because everything has to be extracted separately and re-imported into the code. So one thing to identify in an early stage hard-coded strings, or the way whether you or in which extent you can localize a game, is pseudo-localization. And the tools we have now available, or which are available, catch tools and localization tools, they have specific functions for pseudo-localization, which enable us to identify those positions, and then we have to communicate this to the developers, and so that these problems can be taken away at, well, let's say an early stage. But in each case they lead to a point that is time consuming, because things have to be redone, which should have or could have be done in a better way. So if we think of technical prerequisites, we already heard today that Excel files are often used in this context. I added here text files, because in our context of the LogGem contest, we will have to do with text files. Sometimes RTF files are as well translated, sometimes even docs. XML is used in the game localization process as well, as we heard. I didn't mention HTML, but you mentioned it earlier today. And one format which perhaps seldomly is used so far, but which I suppose will play a more and more important role, is XLIF, because it's a kind of way to exchange data between the localizer and the developer in a more easy way. So what we can see so far, that concerning tools and developing environments, there is a lack of standards in tools and formats, and there is not really a tool for localizing a video game. We heard from Karin that MemoQ now is rather well equipped for some tasks of game localization, but this is more or less a starting point. So catch tools are prepared for documentation, for technical documentation. Very few tools support multilingual files, and we could see that there is a preview to other languages. This is very helpful, especially if you have multilingual Excel spreadsheets. So if you remember well, if you normally take a document, it is overwritten in your CAT tool, but this isn't something you can use in this environment where you have several languages and you wish to add a localized version of your game. So spreadsheets are used, and nowadays catch tools are imperative in this field because on the one hand they are a kind of productivity boost, but they are really the basis for terminological consistency. And if we have a look at tools, so if we heard well, Good Game uses a tool, perhaps a proprietary tool. There are many of them in several environments. Microsoft as well uses an inside tool that localizers have to use, but which you can't purchase on the market. We have a spreadsheet for glossaries, and often we have special conversion tools which with which you can put the format of the spreadsheet into the one needed in the terminological database. And then in some contexts where you have to work together with others, you work with Google Docs to create, manage and share glossaries online. I don't know whether this is the case in one of your companies, but it happens to be. And the reason for which catch tools are used in game localization to speed up translation, in order to control terminology and, of course, to assure the quality of the game, especially if you have updates and releases, so they have to be consistent with each other. So I already mentioned the in-house tool which is used by Microsoft, so Log Studio, for instance, this is one of the tools used in this scene. Log Direct is something more or less new. It's really something which has a certain specialization already for game localization, a tool that is used online as well, and it's a kind of CMS that is, yes, you have features of a catch tool on the one hand, but the predominant features are those of a content management tool. Then you use these kind of tools as well for the, or not only for the translation, but already during the creation of text strings for the translator or for the original game. And it is used as well to control the import and export of text into the game and to transfer the text to the localizer. Then we have localization tools. Most of you know well as Solo, for instance, and we heard already about machine translation, which sometimes is as well used in this domain, but as Karin already mentioned, there can't be machine translation used without post-editing, so therefore sometimes we have specialized post-editing tools to work on the machine translation output. So the CAT tools we use in this field are on the one hand desktop tools, but as we heard from Good Games, nowadays a number of cloud-based or server-based, web-based tools are in use. So among the CAT tools, so this is a list which could be longer. We have, for instance, STL Trados Studio or MemoQ with the features we heard about. And on the side of the localization tools, we can use as well Passolo or Catalyst. And among the cloud-based solutions which recently have come up, something which I find rather interesting is, for instance, ePoint, the ePoint localization platform, or the cloud-based localization management platform. which both have special features for game localization. Here, for instance, this is Transifex. So it looks like a localization environment as MemoQ or Tardot Studio. So you have these tables and percentages for your matches. But there are special video translation features that are very interesting in the domain of game localization. So you have really a help for subtitling in this field. Then I mention here as well MemoQ because of this its ability to show different languages, which could be helpful as reference languages. In the morning we had a presentation of somebody who now finished her master studies here, a young lady who worked about Scandinavian languages, and these are very similar. In these cases, a kind of preview of other translations is very helpful as well. So if we have to process specific file formats, it's not so different in the game environment, in a game environment compared to other software applications. So CAD tools and localization tools in general support XML and text formats. They normally nowadays have as well XLIF support, and in each case you have to configure the parsers so that the text can be well analyzed and the translator afterwards really can concentrate on the text and hasn't to do with the surrounding tags and formatting information. So I now want to invite you that we will have a look at what will happen at the end of February, in the last week of February, starting the 22nd of February to the 1st of March. There will be the Logjam contest. And in this contest, there will be a game that will be a kind of open source environment in which the game will have been developed. It will be Twine, that you can read here, and this is a storytelling environment. So it's a completely web-based game where you can, or where you enter one environment and can make decisions about where you go or what you do. And there is in the beta phase, Karin already mentioned, there the developers have launched or uploaded something with which one can test the own localization results. This is very helpful so that one can have an impression of what one has done or whether the results really fit into the web environment. So in this context we have to do with something you can see over here, and we will in a few minutes examine a little nearer. Here in this case we have to do with text files, or with a text file, because each language has a separate text file, but all the text files have the same format. And the format of the text files which are used here in this environment is that they are numbered, so it's the 9th segment, the 8th one, and so on, and they have a certain format. So the organizers of the contest, they tell you that you can use Notepad to do the localization or the translation, which is true, but you are bare of all useful features, so you don't have a translation memory. If you really only use Notepad, you don't have glossary control, and therefore it's one way to do the localization, but perhaps there is an easier or more comfortable, I'd even say a more professional environment in which one could do the localization. Not necessarily, but there are already tools that support this work. So if we now look at a certain tool, and we will in a few minutes have a look at Passolo and the way we can do the localization with the Passolo, the STL Passolo localization tool. In this case, one has to analyze first the strings. So you have to use Notepad just to get an impression of what the text format is. And I pointed out one thing which is very important in these cases. One has to look for recurrent elements. So which are the strings, the parts that are recurrent in all those strings. And what you see here is those double quotes here, then a number which follows those quotes, a dot, another pair of double quotes, and then those two \n, and any text. So this is something which varies from segment to segment. And then in this case, for instance, one segment fills several lines, and this is the normal case in this environment. And if you look at the end of the segment here, apparently it's the end of a line, but we will see afterwards that perhaps the end of the line is not a necessary condition to configure the parser. So we have to look for a kind of pattern for the localization tool that is able to extract the text from the environment from which it is taken. And this is just the point where Martina and Isabel will have to leave us, and it's as well the point we can move to our computer lab to test which possibilities we have. So have a nice way back. Thank you once again.